It was 2:03 a.m. at Harvard University, the quiet of the night, wrapping the prestigious institution in a shroud of stillness. The only sounds were the soft scrape of Benjamin Matthews' mop against the cold marble floor and the distant hum of the heating system. A janitor at the university, Benjamin had long since become invisible, a fixture in the shadows of the grand halls. The world he was cleaning in the dead of night was not one he belonged to, not really. Yet this was his life, his routine. He moved through the empty halls of the science building, past the impressive lecture rooms, the walls adorned with plaques, bearing the names of the greatest minds in physics. The campus felt like a place that held secrets he could never quite touch. Every so often he would look into a classroom, his heart heavy with the weight of his unfulfilled dreams. Benjamin had been on the verge of something grand once, back when he was a student. But life had pulled him away, his mother's illness, the need to pay bills, and eventually his dreams faded into the background, just like the dust he wiped away from the desks each night. But tonight, something was different as he passed. Room 3.34, one of the largest lecture halls in the building, he noticed something that caused his steps to falter. The door, usually locked at this hour, was ajar. A faint light spilled out, casting long shadows on the floor. Curious, he pushed the door open further, and that's when he saw it. The chalkboard covered in dense, complex equations, the symbols twisted together like a puzzle waiting to be solved. Benjamin's breath caught in his chest. His eyes scanned the equations, his pulse quickening as something deep inside him stirred, something he thought he'd buried long ago. He had seen these equations before, or something very similar, in an old physics lecture he had watched on YouTube years ago, when he still had internet access at home. His mind clicked into gear. His hand reached for the chalk, trembling slightly as he picked it up. He hadn't worked on problems like this in years, not since he was a student, but something about this felt different. His fingers moved instinctively, writing the next line of the equation. His heart raced as the solution started to unfold, the patterns appearing before him like a familiar melody. Minutes passed, and Benjamin was so absorbed in the work that he didn't hear the footsteps approaching the door. The sound of the door creaking open broke his focus, and he froze. Professor Alexander Hartley stood in the doorway. His face was a mask of surprise, his sharp eyes scanning the room before they landed on Benjamin, the renowned physicist, known for his pioneering work on quantum mechanics, was dressed in a simple jacket, his hair tousled from a long night's work. He stared at Benjamin for a moment, his brow furrowing in confusion, before his gaze shifted to the chalkboard. Benjamin's heart skipped a beat. The equations on the board, the ones he'd just solved, were Professor Hartley's own research. This wasn't just some random problem. This was cutting-edge physics, something only a handful of people in the world would understand. "What are you doing?" Benjamin stammered, his voice barely above a whisper as panic surged through him. He didn't know what to say. Was he in trouble? Should he apologize? The professor stepped into the room, his eyes never leaving the chalkboard. Benjamin's mind raced with fear, but when Hartley spoke, it wasn't the reprimand Benjamin expected. It was the opposite. "How do you know this?" Hartley asked, his voice low, but there was no anger in it, only curiosity. Benjamin's mouth went dry. I used to study before I had to leave school." Hartley stood still for a moment, digesting the answer. Then his voice softened. "You're not just guessing at this, are you?" He stepped closer, studying the work on the board, and then his gaze shifted to Benjamin. "You're making sense of this. You're not just a janitor, are you?" Their eyes met, and in that moment, the weight of the question hit Benjamin like a punch to the gut. His world, his dreams, his identity hung in the balance. Benjamin Matthews had never imagined he would be in this place, standing in the cold, cavernous halls of Harvard University at 2 a.m., mopping the same floors that once seemed as distant as stars to a young man with hopes as high as the ceilings. Now at 35, he was no longer the young physics student who had walked through these very corridors with textbooks in hand, ready to unlock the mysteries of the universe. He was the janitor. It wasn't supposed to be this way. Benjamin had been on the fast track to success, or so he thought. As a teenager, he had excelled in everything, especially math and physics. He was a student who showed promise in the classroom, his mind sharp and his curiosity insatiable. Harvard had accepted him on a full scholarship when he was just 18, and the world seemed at his feet. He had been set to revolutionize the field of theoretical physics. But then, tragedy struck. His mother, the only family he had left, was diagnosed with cancer. Stage 4. The doctors said it was a matter of time. Benjamin had to drop out, unable to keep up with both his studies and the mounting medical bills. What followed was a blur of sleepless nights and unrelenting work as he tried to make ends meet. His dreams, once so vivid, slowly faded to the background as the harsh realities of life took over. With each passing year, he found himself cleaning up after the same brilliant minds who occupied the very classrooms he once dreamed of being. And now, his role was one of invisibility. To the students and faculty at Harvard, he was a nameless figure who scrubbed floors, emptied trash cans, and mopped up coffee spills. They didn't know his story. They didn't know about his potential, his thirst for knowledge, or the passion that still burned deep within him for physics. To them, he was just a janitor, a shadow in the corners of their grand academic world. But despite his position, Benjamin never lost his love for science. Every night, when the halls were empty and the university was silent, he would walk past the lecture rooms and glance at the chalkboards. His mind would race with possibilities, equations, and theories that filled the spaces of his life. Physics was more than just a passion for him. It was his identity, the one thing that never abandoned him. He had not given up entirely. He still studied whenever he could, reading old textbooks, watching university lectures online when he had the chance. He was always learning, always thinking, but those thoughts stayed within him, locked away, never shared. The equations he scribbled in his worn notebook were for him alone. He wasn't allowed to play in the world of academia anymore. Professor Alexander Hartley was the opposite of Benjamin in many ways. Where Benjamin had been once hopeful and wide-eyed, Hartley was now a man who had seen too much. He had lived through the highs of academic success, but had come to realize the price of it. In his early years, he had been a prodigy in the field of quantum mechanics. His papers were groundbreaking, his theories revolutionary. He had quickly risen through the ranks, securing a coveted position at Harvard, where he became known for his brilliance. But over time, the passion that had once driven him began to wither under the weight of expectations and the endless demands of academia. He spent his days lecturing to students who were often more interested in grades than knowledge, who memorized equations but lacked the drive to question them. Hartley had grown tired of it all. He no longer sought out brilliant minds, but instead found himself surrounded by students who followed the prescribed path. There were few who truly challenged him, few who pushed the boundaries of his work. Most students came to him already knowing the answers. They just needed to be validated. He had become disillusioned with the academic system, with the lack of real innovation. His own research had slowed. What once had been an exciting pursuit of new ideas was now a routine, a matter of maintaining his reputation, not pushing for new discoveries. He had become a professor for the sake of being a professor, not because he had something to prove anymore. But even in his jaded state, Hartley couldn't help but feel an underlying sense of dissatisfaction with himself. He longed for the fire he had once had, the excitement of tackling new problems and solving them in ways no one else could. Deep down, he was aware that the students who came to him for help were no longer pushing the boundaries of science. They were simply maintaining the status quo. He was an expert surrounded by mediocrity. He often asked himself if this was what his life had become, a collection of papers and lectures, none of which would be remembered in the long run. That all changed the night he saw Benjamin Matthews. When Hartley walked into room 324 that night to retrieve his notes, he never expected to encounter someone like Benjamin. At first, he thought Benjamin was just another janitor going through his motions. But when he saw the chalkboard, something shifted in Hartley. The equations on the board were his own work, yes, but they had been changed, corrected, adjusted, in ways he had never anticipated. As he watched Benjamin add to the problem, he realized that the man had solved parts of his equation that no one else had been able to, including Hartley himself. This was no ordinary janitor. This was a man with a mind capable of understanding the complexities of the universe in a way most people, professors included, could not. Harvard University, with its towering buildings and centuries of academic tradition, served as the perfect backdrop for this unlikely pairing. The architecture of the university, classic, ivy-covered and historic, was both beautiful and intimidating. It was a place where brilliance was expected, where genius was nurtured, and where a janitor like Benjamin Matthews could easily be lost among the grand halls. The science buildings, with their long, dimly lit corridors and glass-walled lecture rooms, became symbolic of Benjamin's world. He walked through these halls each night, surrounded by names of the greatest minds in physics. The walls themselves seemed to echo with the footsteps of history's intellectual giants. And yet, Benjamin felt small. His dreams felt far away, distant, locked behind doors he could never open. The lecture halls were filled with students who had come from families with connections, money, and access. Benjamin, on the other hand, had never had those advantages. He had come from a working-class family and had to fight for everything he had. But in these very halls, his dream remained alive, though the students passed him by, unaware of his existence. Benjamin saw these rooms as places of hope, places where, if given the chance, he could prove himself. And now, through a twist of fate, he had the opportunity to enter this world again. Not as a student, but as someone whose insight had caught the eye of a professor. It was a chance Benjamin never thought he would get. But even as the excitement bubbled within him, a part of him was still terrified. Could he really belong here again? Would the world that had rejected him for so long accept him now? Professor Hartley, standing in the same halls that once filled him with ambition, now found himself looking at a man, Benjamin, who embodied the very passion for knowledge he had once possessed. And just like that, Hartley realized that Benjamin's presence had rekindled something within him, something he had lost long ago. As the tension between them hung in the air, the cold, silent halls of Harvard became the stage for an unlikely mentorship, a chance for both Benjamin and Hartley to reclaim what they had lost, the pursuit of knowledge, the thrill of discovery, and the courage to challenge the world around them. Professor Alexander Hartley stood in the doorway of room 324, still reeling from the unexpected sight he had just witnessed. Benjamin Matthews, the janitor, was not just cleaning the room. He was solving one of Hartley's most complex equations. Hartley had spent months refining the problem, working through endless iterations, but here was a man, in the dead of night, scribbling the final pieces of the puzzle with such ease that it seemed almost effortless. For a brief moment, Hartley questioned his own abilities. How had this janitor, someone who, by all appearances, had no formal academic training, managed to do something his brightest graduate students had struggled with? Benjamin's hands shook slightly as he dropped the chalk and turned to face Hartley. His face was flushed with a mix of panic and guilt, and for a brief second he looked like a child caught in the act of stealing. Hartley took a step forward, his sharp gaze never leaving the chalkboard. He stared at the equations, his mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. This was no random accident. Benjamin had added something to the equation, a small but significant change that, if true, would alter the entire direction of the research. What exactly were you doing? Hartley's voice was low, measured, and carried the weight of both confusion and curiosity. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Benjamin's words stumbled over each other as he backed away from the board, his heart pounding in his chest. I didn't touch anything important, I swear. I was looking at the problem and I thought, maybe I could help. I don't know. I used to study this kind of stuff back when I had the chance. Hartley raised an eyebrow. His eyes narrowed as he took a step closer, his gaze never wavering from Benjamin. "You used to study? You mean you're familiar with this type of problem?" Benjamin hesitated, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what to say. There was no easy way to explain his past, how he had been a promising physics student until his life had been derailed by family tragedy. But the truth was, his passion for physics had never left him. It was all he had left when everything else fell apart. I dropped out of school," Benjamin began, his voice low. "My father got sick. He had cancer. I had to leave to take care of him. I couldn't keep up with my studies, so I started working, cleaning up here at Harvard. It was supposed to be temporary, but it turned into years." His voice faltered, but he pushed on. "And through it all, the one thing that never left me was physics. I couldn't forget it, no matter what." Hartley watched him carefully, processing his words. Benjamin's voice trembled, but the professor saw something in his eyes, a fire, a hunger for knowledge that was rare, even among the brightest students. Hartley had met many people in his career, but few had the kind of raw intellectual curiosity that radiated from Benjamin, even in his current position. For a moment, there was silence. Benjamin shifted uncomfortably, expecting some form of judgment, some reprimand. He had lived in this world of invisibility for so long. He had long since resigned himself to being a ghost in the halls of this prestigious university. The idea that anyone would see him as anything other than a janitor seemed impossible. But to his surprise, Professor Hartley didn't speak with the scorn Benjamin expected. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes scanning the chalkboard once more, his brow furrowing as he absorbed the changes Benjamin had made to the equation. "You're telling me that you've been solving problems like this on your own?" Hartley asked, a note of disbelief in his voice. Benjamin nodded, though he couldn't meet the professor's gaze. "I've been trying to keep up. I watch old lectures, online, read textbooks when I can get them. It's all I have. I don't have a lab, I don't have the equipment, but I can't help myself. I still think about this stuff all the time." The professor was silent for a long moment, his mind whirling. He was used to encountering bright students who were prepared, who had been trained their entire lives for a career in academia. But this was different. Benjamin wasn't just another student trying to get ahead. He was a man who had been forced into the margins, a man who had found a way to keep learning, despite the odds stacked against him. And yet, here he was, offering a perspective on the research that Hartley had never anticipated. After a few moments, Hartley finally spoke, his voice steady but edged with curiosity. "You've done this before, haven't you? Solving problems on your own, looking at equations no one else sees. You didn't just stumble on this by chance. This is—" Hartley paused, as if weighing his next words. "This is something you've been doing for years, in the shadows. It's not luck, it's intuition." Benjamin felt a knot tighten in his chest. He couldn't explain it. How could he? The world had told him time and again that he didn't belong in this space, that his dreams were too big, too unreachable. And yet, here was Professor Hartley, standing in front of him, acknowledging the one thing Benjamin had always kept hidden. "You're right," Benjamin whispered, his voice barely audible. "I've never stopped, it's just hard. I never thought I'd have a chance again." Hartley stepped closer, his expression softening. "Maybe you do," he said, more to himself than to Benjamin. "Maybe you've just been waiting in the wrong place." Hartley's words hung in the air like a challenge. Benjamin had always known that he was capable of more, that his mind had the potential to do great things. But the truth was, he had never allowed himself to believe that anyone would ever see him that way. He was a janitor, a shadow. He had dropped out of school, abandoned his dreams for survival. Yet, here was Hartley, offering something Benjamin had never imagined possible, a chance. "You've got potential," Hartley continued, his voice steady with a hint of awe. "More than most of my graduate students, honestly. I've been looking for someone like you. You have raw insight, an ability to see beyond the surface, to challenge what's already been proven." Hartley paused, then added, "I could mentor you, teach you the things you missed when life pulled you away." help you finish what you started. Benjamin's heart skipped a beat. The thought of returning to the academic world, of having a professor who believed in him, seemed like a dream. But as quickly as the excitement surged, doubt followed. He had spent years cleaning these halls, working in the background, hiding from a world that had no place for him. How could he possibly step back into it now? He opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated. I don't know. I'm just a janitor. What if I'm not good enough? What if I've missed too much? His voice cracked as he said the words, as though admitting to himself the one thing he feared the most. Hartley studied him for a moment, his gaze sharp but not unkind. That's the thing about potential, he said quietly. It doesn't care where you've been. It only cares about where you're willing to go. Benjamin stood still, the weight of Hartley's offer pressing down on him. Could he really return to this world? Could he, a janitor with no degree, no formal credentials, truly belong among these intellectual giants? A small voice in his head whispered, "What if you're right?" He shook his head, trying to shake the doubt away. "I'm afraid, Professor. What if I fail again?" Hartley's eyes softened, and he took a step back. "You won't know until you try. But I'll tell you this. If you want to make it, you have to believe that you're worthy of it. You have to believe that your mind has as much to offer as anyone else in that room." Benjamin met Hartley's gaze, his heart heavy with uncertainty. "What if I'm not ready?" Hartley smiled. "Then we'll make you ready." Benjamin Matthews had never felt more out of place. By day, he walked the polished corridors of Harvard University with a mop in hand, a nameless figure who blended into the background. He scrubbed the same floors he had once walked as a student, only now he was invisible. The golden doors of academia that had once beckoned to him were now firmly closed, and the dream of walking through them again seemed like a cruel illusion. Every day felt like a reminder of what he had lost. He would pass classrooms full of students, also full of potential, their lives mapped out by scholarship, ambition, and resources. Their laughter, their casual conversations about problem sets and lectures was a constant reminder of a world that no longer welcomed him. He had spent years dreaming of walking those halls as a student again, solving problems with the same ease he had once enjoyed. But now, he only cleaned the remnants of their genius, coffee stains, discarded notes, and the occasional physics equations scribbled in haste. At night, when the university was empty and the halls were silent, Benjamin's world shifted. As the moonlight filtered through the windows, he found refuge in the only thing that still brought him peace, his love for physics. The books he had once cherished, the lessons he had fought so hard to understand, became his solace. He would slip into empty classrooms, his mind racing through formulas and equations, trying to solve problems as if he had never left the academic world. He taught himself advanced topics using old textbooks and YouTube lectures, material that had once seemed so accessible, but now felt like a distant memory. Despite his relentless efforts, Benjamin's progress was slow. The fear of being caught, of being discovered as a fraud, gnawed at him every time he picked up his notes. Who was he to think that he could still understand the same material he had once studied so passionately? What made him think he could walk in the shoes of the brilliant minds who roamed these halls, students who had everything he lacked? He was a janitor, a man who had no place in the world of academia. His mind would race through the equations, but self-doubt would always follow. He wasn't a student. He didn't have the resources, the guidance, the opportunities to make real progress. His years of self-study only highlighted the gap between where he was and where he wanted to be. The further he dug into his studies, the more it felt like he was digging himself into a hole, one that was becoming harder to climb out of. Each formula he solved, each theory he understood felt like a victory, until the crushing weight of his reality set in. Benjamin had once been full of promise, but now he feared that those days were over. The fear of failure, of being revealed as someone who didn't belong, kept him from reaching his full potential. He longed for validation, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was always on the verge of being exposed. Professor Alexander, Hartley too, found himself at a crossroads, though the nature of his dilemma was far more subtle, yet equally pressing. After years in academia, he had become disillusioned. The excitement that once fueled his passion for physics had waned. His groundbreaking research, his innovative ideas, had placed him at the forefront of quantum mechanics. Yet, over the years, the joy of discovery had been replaced by the pressure of maintaining his status, managing his reputation, and meeting the expectations of his peers. His work had become predictable. The long hours spent in his office, the endless revisions of papers and journal articles, had grown monotonous. He no longer felt the spark of curiosity that once drove him to push boundaries. The field of physics, to him, had started to feel like a place where only the well-connected and the elite could thrive. His students were bright, but few had the raw, unrefined hunger for knowledge that he had once possessed. Most were content with memorizing equations, following the established path, and seeking approval from their professors. The kind of innovation that had once excited him now seemed rare, almost non-existent. But then came Benjamin. There was something about the janitor, about Benjamin, that struck Hartley deeply. Benjamin's passion for physics was raw, untapped and unrefined, but it was genuine. Unlike the students who had access to all the resources in the world, Benjamin had nothing but his own mind and a deep yearning to understand. His curiosity had not been dulled by privilege or comfort. It had been honed by years of self-study, perseverance, and necessity. And that was what fascinated Hartley. Benjamin's ability to solve complex equations, despite having no formal education, made Hartley realized just how much he had taken for granted. He had spent years surrounded by students with every advantage, and yet none of them had approached problems with the same intuitive insight that Benjamin had displayed. There was something about the way Benjamin saw the world, something that Hartley hadn't seen in his students for years. The janitor's brilliance wasn't shaped by textbooks or professors, but by his raw need to survive in a world that had shut him out. And that, Hartley realized, was rare. Yet as much as Hartley recognized Benjamin's potential, he couldn't ignore the uncomfortable truth that Benjamin didn't belong in this world of academia. Hartley's own assumptions about education and privilege came crashing down. He was torn between offering Benjamin a chance, an opportunity to unlock his potential, and the harsh reality that Benjamin was not the kind of student the system was built for. Would Benjamin be accepted? Would he be able to navigate the world of academia with its rigorous demands and hidden barriers? Or would he, like so many others, be swallowed up by a system that was built to keep people like him out? Hartley was haunted by these questions. He had always believed that talent could be recognized and nurtured regardless of background. But Benjamin's situation made him question everything he had ever believed about education. Was he doing the right thing by offering mentorship to someone who had no place in the academic world? Was he giving Benjamin a chance, or was he setting him up for failure? Hartley's decision to mentor Benjamin was not an easy one. He knew that offering Benjamin a chance would not be without its challenges. It would require him to confront his own biases and the assumptions he had built over years of working in academia. He had spent so long in the ivory tower, surrounded by privilege and opportunity, that he had forgotten what it was like to truly struggle for knowledge. As much as he wanted to help Benjamin, Hartley wasn't sure if he could live up to the responsibility. He had his own reputation to think about, his own career to maintain. Could he afford to risk everything for a janitor who may not even be able to handle the demands of academia? Or would offering Benjamin this chance be the most rewarding thing he had ever done? Hartley found himself at a crossroads, just like Benjamin. Their fates were now intertwined, and the weight of that responsibility loomed over both of them. But as Hartley thought about Benjamin's raw potential, he realized that he couldn't ignore the spark he had seen in the janitor. It was a spark, he had not seen in years, and it had the power to reignite something within Hartley himself. But that spark would only burn if they both dared to step into the unknown. The following week, Professor Hartley invited Benjamin to sit in on one of his advanced lectures on quantum mechanics. It was an unorthodox move. Hartley had never invited someone outside of his academic circle to participate in one of his classes, especially not a janitor, but there was something about Benjamin's raw insight that made Hartley question the rigid boundaries he had once accepted without question. The classroom was packed with students, their eyes glued to the front, where Hartley stood lecturing. As the lesson unfolded, Benjamin sat in the back, a quiet observer, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was filled with the brightest minds in the department, future physicists, mathematicians, and engineers, students who had spent years preparing for a career in academia. Benjamin felt like an outsider, unsure of his place in this world of polished intellects. But despite the feeling of being out of place, he couldn't help but listen intently to every word Hartley spoke. The equations on the board were like music to him, each one a note in a symphony he had longed to play. As Hartley began to explain the finer details of a complex theory, Benjamin couldn't contain himself. His hand shot up almost instinctively. Hartley paused, his eyes flicking to Benjamin, surprised by the interruption. "Yes, Benjamin?" he asked, a trace of curiosity in his voice. Benjamin's voice was steady, though his hands were clammy. "Professor, I think there's an alternate way to approach the second equation. If you adjust the coefficient here," he pointed to the board, "it would simplify the constraint without affecting the overall integrity of the model." A murmur of surprise rippled through the class. Benjamin had barely finished his sentence when Hartley's eyes widened in recognition. The adjustment Benjamin suggested wasn't just a minor tweak. It was a significant insight that could drastically shift the approach to the problem. Hartley nodded, impressed but trying to keep his composure. "That's an interesting observation, Benjamin. Let's explore that," he said, his tone carefully measured. As Benjamin explained his reasoning, the class fell into a hushed silence. Hartley's usual students, those who had spent years studying physics, looked at each other with a mixture of confusion and admiration. Benjamin's solution was elegant, and more importantly, it made sense. It was clear that he understood the theory just as deeply as anyone in the room, despite his lack of formal education. Benjamin, too, was surprised by how naturally the words flowed from him. He had spent years teaching himself, but never had he spoken to an audience like this, especially not a room full of Harvard's finest students. Yet there was a strange comfort in it. Physics was his language, and for the first time he felt like he could speak it fluently without fear of being misunderstood. Hartley, after a brief pause, turned to the class. "Does anyone else have thoughts on this approach?" he asked, looking for validation. Some students hesitated, clearly unsure how to respond. Others quickly started scribbling down notes, but there was a noticeable tension in the air. This was no ordinary student. This was the janitor, the man who cleaned their lecture halls. And yet, his understanding of complex theoretical physics was on par with the brightest minds in the room. The students' reactions were mixed. Some, especially the graduate students, were skeptical. They whispered among themselves, unsure how to process what had just happened. Could a janitor really understand this material as deeply as they did? Was he just lucky, or was there something they were missing? The skepticism grew into subtle whispers of doubt as Benjamin continued to speak, offering more insights into the theory, his voice steady and confident despite the underlying tension he felt. For others in the room, though, Benjamin's presence was something entirely different. They saw themselves in him, the students from humble backgrounds, the ones who had fought for every inch of knowledge they had. To them, Benjamin represented something far more than just a janitor. He was proof that intelligence wasn't confined to the privileged few who had the means to study at Harvard. It was a quiet rebellion against the elitism that permeated academia, a reminder that brilliance could come from anywhere. One of the undergrad students, a young woman named Sarah, leaned toward her neighbor. "This is insane," she whispered, her eyes wide. "A janitor doing what we're supposed to be doing. What does that say about us?" Her friend, sitting next to her, nodded, but there was a hint of defensiveness in his voice. "He's just lucky, that's all. He's been cleaning these rooms for years. Maybe he overheard something, but this is Harvard. No one just walks in, off the street, and gets this." His voice was laced with uncertainty, but his gaze was fixed on Benjamin, as if trying to piece together the puzzle in front of him. Despite the murmurs, Hartley allowed the conversation to unfold. He was a professor who prided himself on challenging his students to think beyond the textbook. But this was different. This wasn't just a student asking a question. It was a janitor, someone on the periphery of academia, offering insights that even his best students hadn't considered. Hartley was torn. Part of him felt a deep sense of pride in Benjamin's intellect, pride that he had recognized this untapped potential. But another part of him was uncomfortable with the idea of someone like Benjamin, someone from outside the academic system, being so integrated into this world. As Benjamin continued to contribute during the lecture, the tension in the room thickened. The professors, though impressed by Benjamin's insights, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. How could a janitor understand quantum mechanics as well as they did? How could someone from the margins of academia come in and challenge their expertise? The whispers of doubt grew louder in Benjamin's mind. What if he was just a fluke? What if everyone else in the room was right, and he didn't belong here? These thoughts gnawed at him as he continued to speak, his mind racing with a combination of excitement and fear. He had always dreamed of this moment, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure if he was ready. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was someone who was being noticed, and with that came a weight he wasn't sure he could bear. Hartley could see the internal battle Benjamin was facing. He had watched the janitor grow more confident with each passing minute, but he could also see the fear creeping in. This wasn't just about understanding physics, it was about identity. Benjamin was being pulled into a world he had once thought was closed off to him. But that world was also full of judgments and expectations that he wasn't prepared for. After the lecture, Benjamin walked out of the room, his head spinning. His contributions had earned him a mixture of admiration and skepticism, but the pressure of being noticed was more overwhelming than he had anticipated. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was a participant in the academic world, a world that had always seemed out of reach. The question was, could he truly belong here? Or was this all just an illusion, a fleeting moment where the truth would soon come crashing down? As Benjamin left the classroom, the students continued to talk amongst themselves, the whispers of doubt growing louder. Meanwhile, Hartley stood at the front of the room, his mind consumed with the implications of what had just happened. He had witnessed something extraordinary, but he also knew that this moment would change everything for Benjamin. The path ahead would be full of challenges, not just from the academic world, but from the very people who would question his right to be there. The tension had only just begun. The day Benjamin Matthews had long feared was finally here. The placement test for Harvard's advanced physics program. It wasn't just an academic challenge, it was a life-changing moment. A moment that would either confirm everything he'd dreamed of or shatter it completely. For weeks, Benjamin had prepared with a sense of urgency that bordered on obsession. Each night, after his shift ended, he would lock himself away in empty classrooms or the university library, poring over advanced textbooks and solving equations until his hands trembled with exhaustion. His mind was sharp, but self-doubt always lingered in the background, whispering that he wasn't enough, that he didn't belong in the same room as the students he had once watched from the shadows. Professor Hartley, seeing Benjamin's dedication, had agreed to mentor him through the process. Yet even as he provided Benjamin with guidance and resources, Hartley couldn't help but question whether this path was a fool's errand. Was Benjamin truly ready to step into a world so far beyond his reach? Was he being kind, or was he setting the janitor up for failure? The test, which was designed to push even the most prepared students to their limits, began early one crisp morning. As the proctor handed out the papers, Benjamin could feel the weight of every gaze in the room. The other students, well-dressed, confident, and well-prepared, exchanged knowing looks as though they were certain of their place. Benjamin, on the other hand, felt like an imposter. His old janitor uniform hung at the edges of his mind like a shadow he couldn't shake. The test booklet felt heavy in his hands, each page a reminder of the chasm that separated him from these students. But as the clock began ticking, something inside Benjamin shifted. This was not the time for doubt. This was his moment. He buried his fears and focused. The problems were difficult, as expected, but he didn't flinch. He worked through each one with precision and speed, recalling the lessons he had taught. Himself, in the quiet hours of the night, for the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider in the room. He felt like he belonged. A week later, the results of the test were posted. Benjamin couldn't bear the anticipation, but when he finally saw his name at the top of the list, his heart skipped a beat. He had not only passed, the results showed that he had outperformed even the most prepared students, the top marks. It wasn't just a victory, it was a statement. He had proven, if only to himself, that he had a mind capable of tackling the most difficult problems in physics. But his triumph was short-lived. The next day, as he walked through the halls of Harvard, Benjamin overheard hushed voices. The students who had taken the exam were talking, some casting curious glances his way. It didn't take long before he heard his name. "Did you hear? Benjamin Matthews. The janitor? He scored higher than half the class." "Impossible." Another voice chimed in, sharp with disbelief. "He had to have cheated. No way someone like him could have figured it out on his own." The voices grew louder, and Benjamin's heart began to race. He felt the weight of their words like a physical blow. He wasn't just an outsider in their eyes anymore. Now he was a threat to the established order. Later that day, as Benjamin walked into Hartley's office, the professor's usual calm demeanor was replaced with something darker. Hartley didn't speak at first. Instead, he handed Benjamin a slip of paper, the official complaint. It was from Jason, one of the top students in the department. Jason claimed that Benjamin had somehow cheated during the exam, suggesting that no one from his background, especially a janitor, could have possibly solved the advanced problems on his own. He called it a fluke, a mistake that needed to be rectified. Jason's words hit Benjamin like a fist. It wasn't the first time he'd been made to feel like he didn't belong, but this time it wasn't just his peers, it was the system itself questioning his merit. Professor Hartley, who had been Benjamin's strongest ally throughout this journey, sighed deeply. He didn't need to read Jason's complaint to know what it contained. It was the same kind of elitist thinking that Hartley had fought against for years. Yet even as his anger rose, he knew that Benjamin was in danger. The administration wouldn't take accusations of cheating lightly, and the backlash could destroy everything Benjamin had worked for. But Hartley wasn't one to back down. If Benjamin had proven anything, it was that he had earned his place in this world. No one, not even the most privileged students, should be allowed to dictate who belonged and who didn't. "I'll stand by you," Hartley said firmly, his voice low but full of conviction. "I've kept a log of your work, the hours you've spent studying. I'll submit everything to the administration, the notes, the equations, the proof that this wasn't a fluke." Benjamin's heart swelled with gratitude, but even as Hartley spoke, a sinking feeling spread through him. He was grateful, yes, but the truth was that the system was already stacked against him. The doubts, the whispers, the unspoken rules about who belonged at places like Harvard, it all seemed too overwhelming to fight. "You've earned your place here, Benjamin," Hartley continued, "and I will make sure they understand that." Benjamin wanted to believe him, but as they walked down the hall to meet with the administration, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about proving his knowledge. It was about proving he was worthy of being part of this world. As they entered the administration office, Benjamin couldn't help but feel like an imposter once again. The walls were lined with degrees and awards, the air thick with the weight of tradition and history. He had never belonged here before, and now it felt like the walls were closing in around him. The head of the department, Dr. Whitmore, a stern man with an air of superiority, glanced at the paperwork. "This is quite the claim," Dr. Whitmore said, his tone flat. "We'll need to review everything before any final decisions are made." Benjamin's stomach churned. He felt like a piece of data being analyzed, a problem to be solved, but not by his own merit, by the decision of people who had never walked in his shoes. As they sat down, Dr. Whitmore looked over the paperwork again. "You've proven yourself capable, Benjamin, but there are concerns. You're not part of this system. You don't have the pedigree of the students here, and there are some who believe your presence here could undermine the integrity of the program." Hartley's face tightened. "Benjamin's presence here is the very thing that makes Harvard great. This university was built to challenge the status quo, to let talent rise regardless of background. You've been out of touch with that for far too long." The meeting dragged on, filled with bureaucracy and resistance. As Hartley argued passionately for Benjamin's place, Benjamin felt a wave of resignation wash over him. This wasn't about the work he had done. It was about the idea of someone like him being allowed in, someone who wasn't from the right background. In the end, Hartley's words carried weight, and the university begrudgingly allowed Benjamin to stay. But the battle had taken its toll. As they left the office, Benjamin felt a pang of bitterness. He had earned his spot, but the cost of getting there had been higher than he ever expected. Hartley, too, was disillusioned. He had spent years in academia, pushing boundaries, but in this moment he realized that the system he had fought for wasn't as ideal as he had once believed. He had seen something special in Benjamin, but now he questioned whether that was enough. Would the world he had dedicated his life to ever truly recognize someone like Benjamin? Would the academy change? Or would it remain a place for the privileged, rejecting those who didn't fit the mold? As Benjamin walked away, he couldn't help but wonder the same thing. Had he really earned his place, or was he just a token in a system that had never intended to make room for him? The days following the tense meeting with the university administration passed in a blur. Benjamin's mind was still reeling from the accusations, the doubts, and the suffocating weight of scrutiny that had been placed upon him. But as the dust began to settle, the inevitable arrived. Benjamin Matthews had officially passed the placement exam. Harvard's advanced physics program had accepted him. It should have felt like a triumph, a moment of pure victory. But it didn't. Instead, there was a lingering sense of unease that he couldn't shake off. The world of academia, once so clear in its idealism, had revealed its many layers, none of them as perfect as Benjamin had imagined. Yes, he had earned his place among the students who had studied their whole lives for this. But the cost had been higher than he had anticipated. His success had come at the expense of his identity, his sense of belonging, and the reality that despite his brilliance, he would always be fighting to prove himself. Benjamin stood in front of his dorm room that night, his hands trembling as he held the letter confirming his acceptance. The weight of it, the paper, the symbol of everything he had worked for, felt almost too much to carry. He had spent years cleaning the floors of this university, invisible to the world, and now here he was, an accepted student. Yet, as he stared at the letter, the feeling of triumph felt distant, like a dream he couldn't fully claim. The students, his peers, still looked at him with suspicion. They whispered when they thought he couldn't hear. Some had openly doubted his place in the program, claiming his results were a fluke, a mistake, and the administration, while allowing him to stay, had made it clear that they didn't truly accept him. He was an anomaly, a token student who had somehow slipped through the cracks of the system. To them, he was still the janitor who didn't belong. His mind wandered back to the days when he was cleaning the same halls that now seemed so cold, so full of barriers. Back then, all he had was hope, a fragile thing held together by his sheer will to keep going. And now, Despite all his effort, despite everything he had achieved, he still felt like an outsider, not entirely part of the world of academia, but forced to exist in it anyway. The emotional scars of Benjamin's past were not as easily erased as his doubts. The guilt over his father's death still haunted him. It wasn't just the loss of his father, it was the feeling of having abandoned his own dreams, of being forced to let go of the life he had imagined for himself to take care of someone else. His mother had passed shortly before his father, leaving him with nothing but the weight of responsibility and an overwhelming sense of loss. Benjamin had never truly had time to grieve. The needs of survival had always come first. That same sense of abandonment, of giving up something precious for the sake of others, followed him now as he stepped into the world of academia. He had never had the chance to truly mourn what he had lost, and every day he spent in this new world only reminded him of how far away his past had become. Yet, as he walked through the halls of Harvard, once a place where he had only dreamed of belonging, he found something new. He wasn't just surviving anymore. For the first time in years, he was thriving. The very equations that once seemed like unattainable goals were now things he could solve with confidence. The lectures that he had watched from the sidelines as a janitor were now his to participate in, to contribute to. He wasn't just a shadow anymore. He had earned this place. He had fought for it, clawed his way through the obstacles, the doubts, and the rejection. And despite everything, he had finally done it. But even as he stood on the edge of this victory, he couldn't ignore the loneliness that gnawed at him. He was still the man who came from nothing. He was still the janitor who had cleaned the same rooms where students now sat, pretending to belong. He had proven that he had the mind of a physicist. But did that really matter if he still didn't feel like he was a part of this world? That night, as Benjamin sat alone in his dorm room, the familiar weight of self-doubt crept in again. He looked out the window, his gaze drifting over the campus. The trees outside were swaying gently in the breeze, the moon casting a soft glow over the brick buildings. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember his life before all of this, the years of sweeping floors, of feeling invisible, of holding on to his dreams in the dark. And then, in the quiet of his room, he finally allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in a long time: pride. The next day, as Benjamin walked through the campus, he felt the weight of his acceptance letter in his bag. But something had shifted. He wasn't just carrying a piece of paper. He was carrying years of struggle, of perseverance, of quiet victories no one had ever seen. And as he passed the familiar lecture halls, the same rooms where he had once stared through the windows, he no longer felt like an outsider. He had made it. He had earned this place, not just through his knowledge, but through his journey. The world didn't have to accept him. What mattered was that for the first time in his life, he could finally accept himself. That afternoon, as he sat in the student lounge, a group of students came over to him. Jason, the one who had once accused him of cheating, was there too. He walked up to Benjamin, hesitated for a moment, and then extended his hand. "You really did it," Jason said, his voice barely audible. "You belong here, Matthews. I was wrong." Benjamin looked at him for a moment, unsure of how to respond. The words felt strange in his mouth, the acknowledgement of his place in this world. But he smiled, and for the first time, the smile didn't feel like a mask. It felt real. "Thank you," Benjamin said softly, his voice steady. "It wasn't easy, but I've been fighting for this for a long time." Jason nodded and stepped back. And as he did, Benjamin felt the weight of the past few weeks lifting. The whispers, the doubts, they didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the journey he had taken, the distance he had traveled. The rest of the world would come to understand that just as he had. As Benjamin walked back to his dorm that night, he felt different. The halls of Harvard no longer seemed so daunting. He had earned his place, not because someone had handed it to him, but because he had fought for it. The pain, the loneliness, and the guilt still lingered, but they no longer defined him. He wasn't the janitor who had dreamed of being a physicist. He was a physicist, a student, and for the first time in a long time, he truly belonged. "Benjamin," Matthews had come a long way, not just through the halls of Harvard, but through the trials of his own life. And now, standing on the precipice of his future, he realized that it was not the acceptance letter that mattered most. It was the fact that he had never given up, that he had continued to fight for his place, even when the world told him he didn't belong. The rest of his life had only just begun. Benjamin Matthews stood in the hallway of Harvard University, no longer holding a mop, but a notebook. The familiar weight of the university's walls surrounded him, but this time it didn't feel like a prison. He had come full circle, once. Invisible, now a student, no longer relegated to the margins. He had earned his place here not by chance, but through sheer will and determination. The mop he once wielded was now replaced by his textbooks, his life no longer confined to cleaning the hallways of academia. But as he walked toward his next class, a quiet understanding settled over him. This journey, this victory, was not an end but the beginning of something greater. He was no longer the janitor who had once dreamt of the world that had always seemed so far away. He was now a part of that world. And yet, the struggles, the doubts, the battles against a system that had never truly been designed for someone like him, they weren't over. There would be more hurdles to overcome, more challenges to face, and more moments where the world would try to remind him of where he had come from. Benjamin's heart beat a little faster as he walked toward his lecture hall. He had learned a lot about himself, about how far he had come, but the hardest part was still ahead. The road to acceptance, to self-worth, was never smooth, and Benjamin knew that while his name might now be on a class roster, his real test had only just begun. He was no longer the janitor who swept floors in the shadows, but did that mean he would ever fully fit in with those who had been born into this world of privilege and opportunity? He had earned his place, but in his heart there remained a quiet fear that he would always be the outsider, the one who had to prove his worth over and over again. Still, there was something different about him now. He no longer had to hide his talents, his intellect. He knew that talent, true, raw talent, could not be hidden forever. It would rise to the surface just as Benjamin had done. And while his struggles were far from over, they were no longer the kind that would break him. He had survived the hardest parts. Now it was time to thrive. As he entered his lecture hall, the room filled with chatter, laughter, and the rustling of papers. For a moment, Benjamin stood at the threshold, taking in the scene. It felt strange to be here amongst his peers, strange but not unwelcome. He was no longer the janitor they barely noticed. He was a student, a fellow intellectual. The moment wasn't grand, but it was significant. As he walked to his seat, Benjamin felt the weight of his own transformation. He was no longer invisible. He was now a part of the very world that had once felt like a distant dream. And for the first time, he felt that he had a future here, one that was his to shape. Benjamin, as he takes his seat in the lecture hall, his classmates are still talking, laughing, unaware of the weight of his journey. But Benjamin doesn't mind. He's no longer invisible. His presence in the room, his steady determination, speaks volumes without saying a word. This story isn't just Benjamin's. It's the story of anyone who has ever felt overlooked, unheard, or unseen. It's the story of those who have been pushed to the margins of society, who have been told that they don't belong, and who have fought to prove their worth despite the odds. Benjamin's journey is a reflection of all the people who have been underestimated and underestimated themselves. It's about persistence in the face of adversity, the willingness to show up even when the world has told you that you don't have a place in it. The lesson here is simple yet profound. No matter where you start, no matter how many obstacles you face, if you have the passion, the intelligence, and the determination to keep going, you can achieve the dreams that once seemed so far out of reach. The world may try to keep you in the shadows, but talent cannot be hidden forever. If you keep showing up, keep pushing forward, the doors will eventually open. As Benjamin sits in the lecture hall, preparing for the lesson to begin, he knows that this is just the beginning. His story is no longer just about surviving, it's about thriving, about proving that people like him, people who have been told they don't belong, can rise and make their mark in a world that didn't make space for them. So the next time you find yourself doubting whether you belong, remember Benjamin's story. It's not about where you start, it's about how much you're willing to fight to get where you want to go. Just keep showing up, keep learning, keep pushing the boundaries of what you can achieve, because, like Benjamin, you'll find that the world you once thought was out of reach is not only yours to claim, it's yours to change. In the end, the story isn't about whether Benjamin Matthews belongs at Harvard. It's about how he got there and how we all can get there. No matter where we start.